Hello, this is Tom Breeze with Emma Thayer from the Clinical Practice Workstream. We're giving some examples specifically aimed at music and drama mentors, but possibly applicable to mentors from other subjects and age phases as well. And what we're aiming to do here is to give a little bit of clarity to what we mean by the part of clinical practice called research and inquiry.
Before we do that, we just wanted to step back and take another look at what we mean by clinical practice, and specifically what we mean by clinical reasoning and fostering clinical reasoning skills and approaches amongst our student teachers. So I'm going to look to a source now entitled Theories of Professional Learning, a Critical Guide for Teacher Educators by Carey Philpott. And there's a nice description here of developing clinical reasoning that comes from the relevant chapter on clinical practice. And it reads, evaluating the current situation and planning what to do next based on evidence and knowledge of research and theory is referred to as clinical reasoning, or practical theorising, or clinical judgment. And that comes from a range of different researchers. These require the critical comparison and synthesis of different forms of knowledge, such as practitioner experience and research-based theory. Clinical reasoning integrates forms of knowledge rather than privileging one over the other. And I'm just going to interject there and say that this means that some of the very, very important knowledge that you pass on to your student teachers that is based on your own experience, expertise, and what we call kind of tacit knowledge of teaching and learning is no less or more influential than what the student teachers experience and learn about from books and what they come to know and understand at university. So I'll just repeat that line. Clinical reasoning integrates forms of knowledge rather than privileging one over the other. Ways need to be found to explicitly consider how different forms and disciplines of knowledge can be integrated in practice rather than leaving it to chance. The most authentic development of clinical reasoning will occur in school. So that's the kind of bigger picture rationale and justification of why A, we've adopted this clinical practice approach, but B, what research and inquiry is hopefully helping student teachers to do for them to be able to engage in this idea of clinical reasoning, to make sense of what's going on in their practice and hopefully to help them progress in that area. I'm going to then quote from our own clinical practice guide, which will hopefully help you to understand how research and inquiry, which, as you can see, is baked in to their weekly to-do list and time spent whilst they're on placement with yourselves, and how we describe research and inquiry activities more generally in the clinical practice guide. So it reads, with guidance and support from the IT coordinator, senior mentor, research champion and university tutor, research and inquiry will allow student teachers to draw upon research findings, information and different sources of expertise from university and school-led training, interrogating these against one another in developing their own personal theories of teaching and learning. And this is research-informed clinical practice. So hopefully you can see how our description of research and inquiry, and indeed research-informed clinical practice, dovetails with what's coming through in the literature from Philpott about clinical reasoning.
So who actually sets students off on research and inquiry tasks? Well, some of them are prescribed by us at the university in the form of subject-specific or phase-specific tasks. There are also some specific research and inquiry tasks that come out of the school-led training days. Students themselves can identify areas that they wish to inquire into, to carry out research and inquiry into based on their own self-perceptions of areas for development or perhaps just things that they find interesting around school. But it's really important to bear in mind as well that this research and inquiry time and these activities of different types can be prescribed by a senior mentor or a mentor. in response to areas for development or in response to particular interesting things that are going on in schools. So the actual impetus for the carrying out of a research and inquiry activity can come from a number of different quarters. And the different activity types that are laid out in the Clinical Practice Guide, different ones will be more or less appropriate at different times, just according to what the actual area of interest is, but also in terms of the journey that the student goes on as they're working through the programme. And we draw on an article by Dan Davis, who was previously Dean of our school not so very long ago, entitled Pragmatism, Pedagogy and Philosophy, a model of thought and action. And what Dan Davis says is that student teachers go through this continuum where they start off at the pragmatic level. So they're basically at survival stage. They're looking at the nuts and bolts. They're not very philosophical at that stage. They move from that once they get their feet under the table in school a little bit and get up and running to a pedagogical domain where they're less interested in the nuts and bolts and more interested in learning and the learning potential of what they're doing. And then the final stage of their continuum is when they become truly reflective and truly philosophical, and they're able to change their practice or bend what they do to service the philosophies and beliefs that they've developed as a teacher during those months on clinical practice. And so, as you can imagine, the sort of activities they'll be carrying out and the sort of topics that they'll be interested in are going to change as they work through that continuum from pragmatic through pedagogical to finally philosophical.
So what we will attempt to do now with this new suite of professional learning resources designed to support you in supporting your student in engaging in bespoke inquiry activities is some really concrete examples of different activities that you can prescribe to your student teachers, or that indeed, as Tom said, could be student-led, that also interface and are relevant to each stage on the continuum that Tom has just described in relation to Dan Davis's work. Now, there is a list in the Clinical Practice Guide of bespoke inquiry activities and how you might prescribe for your student teachers to spend that time. And I think it's worth mentioning at this point as well that we're talking about the kind of the time on their timetable in the week, which is down as bespoke inquiry. So this is time that doesn't necessarily have a task dedicated to it, and therefore should be derived from a need that's particular to the student at that point in time. So from that list, we've got things like observation of experienced teachers with different classes, observation of learners, observation of professionals such as outside agencies providing support for learners with, say, for example, English as an additional language, learning rounds and lesson study. Now, learning rounds and lesson study have got a lot of research underpinning them, and they're slightly more complex than some of the other points on this list that we've just mentioned. We're not going to go into those in too much depth and detail now, but we will at a later date. Learning conversations, video stimulated reflective dialogue, and the list goes on. So it's worth having a look at that. But hopefully what we will try to do is to put a bit more meat on the bones of that list now in these clear examples that follow.